said, my name is Niamh. I'm a front-end developer, and today I want to talk about working from home and what kind of impact that can have on us and how we can overcome one of its biggest challenges, isolation. So today I want to look at ways that we can stop procrastinating, reduce anxiety, increase productivity, and regain concentration. And hopefully, with this, you can continue to grow and develop at home on your own, just as you would working in an office surrounded by your team. So, because we're all here, I think there's a good chance that a lot of us have struggled with working from home at some point. And if you have, that's not really entirely surprising. In the last few years, a lot of material has been published looking into working from home, and isolation is an issue that crops up quite a lot. For example, Buffer's annual research highlighted loneliness as one of the top issues over the last couple of years. A recent global survey found that 61% of UK respondents said they'd return to the office immediately if they could. And websites like The Sound of Colleagues, a site that plays background noises from the office, which first started off as a joke in 2020, had over 500,000 listeners in just the first couple of months after going live. So this is just to say that isolation is a real issue and it's affected a lot of us. Of course, that doesn't mean it doesn't have any value. Working remotely can have some great benefits, including you don't have to dedicate any time or energy to a daily commute anymore, which can be very nice. You might gain more focus without office distractions. And you probably have a bit more flexibility to work from different locations. But what good is all of this if you can't actually get into a good flow while you're doing your job? So when you picture remote work, you might conjure up an image of Bill Gates in his lakeside cabin on his annual reading week, inhaling like 25 books a day. Or maybe that like really intense and slightly scary engineer who totally thrives on their own, does not play well with others, and wears the term loner like a badge of honor. Or you might think of maybe some version of yourself who, because of the pandemic, was suddenly uprooted out of their office and every routine and forced to work at home. And you could be at home either completely on your own, maybe you might have some kids that you have to look after while you're working, or you could be crammed around the kitchen table with 5 other housemates. And all of this without any kind of manual on how to stay connected with your friends or colleagues, how to maintain your workflow, or how to stay stimulated without being able to just swivel your chair around and start up a discussion. Isolation has lots of pros and cons and lots of risks and opportunities. And we'll try to unpack all of this and discuss some processes and tools to help avoid pitfalls and make the most of what it has to offer. But before we dive into it, a bit about me. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Niamh. I'm a front-end web developer. And before remote working became such a big thing, I lived in London. And now I live in Dublin where I work from home full time. And I work at a company called Elsewhen. Been there a little over 2 years and I love working there. Elsewhen is a digital service and product consultancy based in London that builds all sorts of products like fitness apps to satellite communications with all sorts of clients from small startups like Magic Mountain to more established companies like Spotify and Google. And before Elsewhen, I got into coding through meetups, which I imagine maybe a lot of people here did. And this is how I ended up diving kind of headfirst into the tech community. So these, for example, are just some of the meetups I was going to on a regular basis in London. And I loved going to these kind of events. Usually, you'd go right after you finish a long day of work, but instead of just going straight home to crash on the couch, you get to wander through the city looking for the event. Usually you'd find it in some like swanky tech company's office where, you can go and have a poke around to see what it looks like. And when you arrive, usually someone will hand you a nice cold beer. You grab a slice of pizza, everyone around you is buzzing and chatty and excited to start messing with some code. So it's really, really fun. And I think meetups like these are so successful because engineers, I think, genuinely love going to them. And for me, that's because learning to code and just kind of working in tech in general can be really hard. And having a strong sense of community does a lot to relieve some of the intensity that can come with it. So when I was going to all of these meetups, I was also working in a really nice, lovely, kind of typically techie office. It was bang in the middle of Shoreditch in London, right between a very cute little pub and a very cool, trendy pasta restaurant. And we had office dogs, we had fancy coffee machine, we did team lunches almost every day, and a sneaky pint or two every week. It was the dream, which is why when everyone suddenly started working from home, I, of course, very quietly and very inwardly began to freak out. I thought, I'm never going to be able to handle this. There is no way I'm going to be able to maintain my current skills, let alone learn anything new. I'll completely forget how to interact with other human beings. And of course, in the end, I will simply lay down and let the world cave in on me. Now, obviously, that was a bit dramatic. But I'd love to sit here, at the same time over a year later and say, well, actually, it all turned out to be like really easy and it had zero impact on my mental health. And we are doing nothing but thriving over here 24/7. But of course, that's not true. And that's because working remotely can be really hard and complicated. But one thing I've learned is that it does not have to mean the end of the world. So let's dig into it. I want to go through three frameworks with you today in the hopes that you can take them away and use them going forward to help. One, identify when working from home isn't working for you. Two, equip you with some tools that'll help lift yourself out of that funk. And three, outline some good practices that you can use to help yourself stay on top of it. So let's start off with getting to know when working from home isn't quite doing it for you. And I think this one is all about cultivating self awareness, which sounds very like light and spritzy and like something Oprah would do in her sleep, but it's actually something I find pretty challenging. And I knew I needed to work towards this when I realized over the course of a few months of working from home, I gradually lost my ability to concentrate. I lost interest in my side projects pretty gradually. I became super lethargic and sluggish all the time. I spoke to people less and less, and I began to feel pretty overwhelmed by everyday tasks. And I was in such a deep funk for such a long time that I really had no clue that I was actually showing pretty standard symptoms of depression. And it wasn't until someone else brought this to my attention that I started to realize working in isolation was having a serious impact, not just on my working life, but on my personal life too. See, before working from home, my day would usually look something like this. I would head out in the morning commute with a good book or a podcast to get stuck into on the tube. I'd get a bit of fresh air and some light exercise on the walk to the office. And when I got in, I would usually put my stuff down, go make a cup of tea, and spend a bit of time chatting to my colleagues. And of course, like a lot of people in tech, I'd usually start off the day with a quick stand up before settling into my tasks at a big old desk, sat next to my peers, where if I ever needed to ask a question or anything, all I had to do was turn around and ask. Cut to no commute, pretty much like gave up reading completely, and had no chats in the mornings, and was having a lot of Zoom calls. And while it all started out as this great novelty, gradually, as I say, I did fall into that funk. And I had no real idea that it was taking such a toll on me. So I knew I needed to become more self aware to snap myself out of it. And, I don't know if anyone here has ever Googled self awareness before, but it makes some pretty big promises. Apparently, if you learn to hone this skill, you will increase your confidence and creativity. You will make sounder decisions, and you will build stronger relationships and communicate more effectively. Apparently, you are also less likely to lie, cheat, and steal. You are better workers who get more promotions, and you're more effective leaders with more satisfied employees and more profitable companies. I mean, this all sounds totally amazing, right? But if, like me, you might be thinking, well, where do I start? Well, let's take a look at some of the typical challenges you might face when you're working from home all the time. Procrastination. Okay, so I feel like everyone's done a bit of this at some point, right? And I don't think it matters how much stuff is on your plate. If you're working from home, It's just a lot easier to avoid stuff compared to when you're in the office. And this could mean things like you're leaving things until the last minute. Maybe it's a certain task you think is going to be a real slog, or maybe it's as small as bringing something up in a meeting. And usually, if you're doing this, you're also pretty likely to be feeling overwhelmed with work, often by the thought of tasks that actually are pretty routine and, by all accounts, not a huge deal. And if you're guilty of a bit of procrastination, chances are you're building up some anxiety around whatever it is you're putting off. And anxiety is, of course, different for everyone, but some of the common tells, I think, include feeling overtired all the time, like maybe you're not sleeping enough, or maybe even sleeping too much. And you could be having a little bit more, or you could be feeling a little bit more irritable than usual. Maybe you're being a bit short with your friends when you don't need to be. And you might find yourself dealing with physical compulsions like chewing your lip a lot, or biting your nails, or maybe even just cleaning your house a little bit too obsessively for your own liking. And productivity. So, this is a big one. You might be worried that you're not working quickly enough, or that the quality of your work is starting to wane a bit, which, of course, can become a really big stress for a lot of people. You might also find yourself not really listening to others that much. Maybe it's just during calls every now and then, or maybe it's when someone's trying to give you some feedback and you're thinking, well, I already know why this happened and it's because of X, Y, and Z. And like, why are you even telling me? And finally, concentration. And I think this is pretty common. So this might mean that you're zoning out on calls, which of course I'm sure we're all guilty of now and again, but maybe you're doing it a bit more often than you'd like. You could be making lots of silly mistakes in your code, or maybe becoming a bit more forgetful than usual. For example, you might just like find yourself staring at your screen and forgetting what it was you're supposed to be doing, or even in a conversation and forgetting what your point was. And a lot of the time, you might find yourself feeling unsettled and restless at your desk, constantly kind of getting up and down and doing little bits around the house during the day. So, these are all just examples of how working from home might not be helping you out. But of course, as I say, everyone's totally different, right? So, if this is something that you are struggling with or that you have, I recommend kind of mapping out your own examples like this. And hopefully, it can kind of act as a sort of jump start into becoming a bit more self aware. And you can start to recognize when isolation might be messing with your rhythm a bit. Okay, so let's have a look at the solutions. So, okay, I want you to like imagine you've become the most self-aware person ever, and you know all of your bad habits, and you can spot behaviors as they're happening in real time. So, you could argue that actually this is kind of useless unless you're practicing self-management as well. So, I want to take a look at the second step, which is all about getting better at self-management. And I'll go through the challenges we outlined before and offer some solutions that you can try to help yourself out of those habits. So we'll start with procrastination. Okay, so the first point is about multitasking. And I think a lot of people think of multitasking as this amazing skill that makes you super productive, but actually it can be really draining because instead of doing two things at once, your mind is actually kind of constantly switching back and forth between them. And it ends up sapping your energy, meaning you're a little bit more likely to give in to distractions. So try to minimize doing that, and it'll have a real impact on procrastination. I don't know about anyone else, but I love a good to do list. But the way that you word each item in your list can actually have an impact on how much you procrastinate. So, what you could try is listing actions and not goals. For example, if I have finished building this feature on my to-do list, that's not a goal. That's actually, or sorry, it is a goal. It's not an action. You're more likely to start ticking things off your list if you break that goal down into smaller, more attainable actions. So, for example, that might be, in my case, one, find the cause of this bug, two, pseudocode the solution, three, test the fix, and four, make a pull request. You're a lot less likely to give in to distractions when you're near the end of a task. And activating your to do list like this puts you in that home stretch zone a bit more often, which minimizes your risk of procrastination. And pure powwows. Okay, so the thing that I without a doubt procrastinate on the most is my side projects. And if you're guilty of this too, then collaborating can really help. And I don't think this needs to mean inviting someone in to like rework your entire project or even make any substantial contributions. I think having a conversation about it or just showing it to someone can count as well. And when you're working in isolation, an easy way to do this is to start up some peer powwows. So, this is where you reach out to someone at work, someone who's maybe at a similar level to you, but who you don't usually work with directly. Invite them to have a short call with you, maybe every other week, where you can chat about how you're both getting on at work, new things that you're excited to work on or learn, some side projects you're thinking about, or even just shoot the breeze and see what happens. If you tend to procrastinate on side projects like me, this could be a really great way to be held accountable by someone else and start reframing your project from a chore to something that you can get excited about and look forward to again. Okay, so let's take a look at what we can do to mitigate anxiety. So, when it comes to feeling overwhelmed or anxious, I feel like 99% of the advice out there is to just talk to someone, right? And it sounds super straightforward, but this can be really daunting. And if you're already feeling a little overwhelmed, instead of this being helpful, it can actually just feel like one more thing to put on your to do list. And that ends up just compounding all of the anxiety, which is not what you want. So, this vent or advice hack is what I use when I'm feeling anxious, but I also feel like I want to talk something through. So, before starting a conversation with someone, all you have to do is tell the other person whether you want advice or whether you want to vent. And it's a great little caveat because if you're venting, you're letting the other person know that you don't want any problem solving from them. You just want them to listen and do nothing else. But if you do want advice, it means that they can offer it to you without feeling like they're adding to your anxiety. And you can use a similar approach if you don't feel like talking, or maybe you just can't reach anyone for a chat. Take whatever it is that's causing you stress or worry and ask yourself, is there anything I can do about this right now? If the answer is yes, do it right there and then. If the answer is no, try to let it go. And I know that's easier said than done, and it does take practice, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And I find this to be really, really helpful. Another great practice is keeping a worry journal. So I've always been a bit of a worrier anyway, but when I started working from home alone most of the time, slowly but surely, I started to spend a lot more time just worrying about stuff. And it's exhausting. So I find this solution to be one of the most effective. The way it works is during the day, as you notice yourself worrying, write it down. Take note of the thought itself, the time of day, where you are when it's happening, and what you were doing when the thought came into your head. And this isn't about coming up with answers for each of them just yet, because I know it's really tempting, but it's just more about recognizing the circumstance in which you're doing it. So hopefully, after a week or so, you'll kind of have this amazing map of all of your thought patterns, and you can put it to good use when you're trying to regain some of your productivity. Okay, so once you've gotten this map of all of your thought patterns and all of your worries, you can use this practice with the worry step. And you do this by continuing to jot down your worries throughout the day as they come to you. At this point, hopefully you're able to recognize when you're doing it, so it comes naturally, or at least a bit easier. So you don't need to be writing down like the time and the situation and all the rest of the stuff. You can just write down the worries themselves. So what you do is you schedule a time every evening to go through them one by one and worry about them. So when it comes into your head, instead of worrying about it right there, you write it down and think, I'll worry about this later on. And I know it sounds pretty ridiculous, but if anxiety is impacting your productivity, I promise you this totally works. So you choose a specific spot in the house, a chair or a step, for example, and you go to it at the same time every day and dedicate 20 minutes, no more, no less, to worrying about the things on your list. And it sounds super silly, right? But that is the point. By the time that you go to worry about all of the things that you've listed, usually one, you will not care as much. Two, you won't have wasted any time or energy thinking about it during the day, or at the very least, you'll have wasted less. And three, you will probably end up having a good laugh at your own expense because of how preposterous the whole thing is. So that's the worry step. Another good thing I think to do is to know your peak productivity times and work around them. Don't try to do it the other way around all the time. So if you're a real morning person, for example, like me, your natural disposition is to like turn into a bit of a potato every afternoon. Try ordering your tasks each day according to this rhythm. For example, you might take time to tackle some of the more complicated problems in the morning when you know you're at your sharpest. Or you might request that no one schedules meetings with you during these times. And if you use Google Calendar, there's that focus time block you can add so people know that you need to prioritize your own stuff during these times, which I find super handy. And exercise. Again, I think this is one of the most common bits of advice that everyone hears all the time, but it can be one of the most difficult to take on. And it doesn't mean that you have to like go run a marathon or start doing circuits or whatever. It can literally mean just going for a walk. And I think it's better to do something small like this. That way, it's easier to fold into your routine and it's more likely to become a habit. So you might start off just by going for like a 10-minute stroll at the same time every day. Maybe before work instead of your commute. Whatever it is, just make sure that it's a time that suits you. For me, for example, I started swimming every morning, and while that's not everyone's cup of tea, it works for me. So that's why I continue to do it. And it really, really sorts me out anytime I'm in a slump. Okay, so now concentration. This is another one that I think is definitely exacerbated by working from home. But of course, it's not without its solutions. So you might have heard of the Pomodoro technique already. This is where you break your work down into timed 25-minute chunks, usually followed by a 5-minute break where you list the things that you're going to focus on in the next 25-minute slot. And you can use your own timer to try this, or there are some like online tools that'll help you if you prefer. And I'll tweet that along with a lot of other resources after the talk later on. But what I find especially useful about this is measuring your success not by how much stuff you can get done, but by how well focused you remain in each time slot. And I think this is a really nice way to start thinking more about the quality of your work instead of the quantity. Okay, and I feel like everyone's heard that fresh air is good for you. This is like not brand new information. Um, but if you're struggling to get motivated for exercise and you're not going for your daily walks or whatever, maybe you even just don't have time because you're so swamped with work, you can get some benefits by just opening a window. Fresh air helps you stay more alert. It'll increase your capacity to concentrate and, not melt into a big blob at 4 o'clock every day. And better yet, if you can, you face a window and you can get some of that sweet vitamin D at the same time. And try not to miss one-to-ones. Now, I know you can't necessarily make every meeting every single time. And if you're cooped up at home on Zoom all day, it might be super tempting to skip catch-ups, especially if you have no major news or updates to share with your line manager. But I think that's all the more reason to go to them. Like I mentioned before, when you're at home, opportunities for off-the-cuff conversations are far and few between most of the time. So take them while you can get them. At the very least, it'll help you practice your potentially waning social skills and stay in touch with your manager and continue to develop that relationship on a personal level. Okay, so these are, just to summarize that section, these are, in my experience, some of the best ways that you can help lift yourself up out of that working from home funk. And usually, or I should say, hopefully by this stage, if you're using these tools, you have learned how to spot when struggling from home is not working for you, working from home even, implemented some changes to combat its biggest challenges. And so at this point, this is you. You are thriving, right? So let's say at this point, you're Angela Lansbury, thriving, your productivity is up, your mood is good, you're nailing all of your work, and you are just living your best working from home life. The last thing you want to do is fall back into these traps, right? So before I finish up, I want to just go through a few extra tools and practices you or your company can use to stay on top of things and avoid falling back into that funk. And the main thing I think is to try and stay social. So let's have a look. So as I said, chance conversations with colleagues is pretty rare now, right? Well, This isn't the same thing exactly, but it's a nice solution for remote working. Donut is a Slack extension that on a regular basis can let you randomly pair up with colleagues for coffee breaks, maybe every other week or so. Granted, it's a little more structured than you get in real life, but it's a nice way to stay connected to your colleagues on a personal level, set aside some time for non work conversation, and even get to know new joiners to the company who you might not otherwise have a chance to meet. And similarly, it's a lot harder to get regular feedback on your performance when you're not physically in the same room as your peers or managers. And I know sometimes it can feel a little awkward reaching out to ask for stuff like this. So you can kind of automate it. Why not just set up a regular recurring call with your team lead or your manager that's just dedicated to reviewing your work and giving constructive feedback? I find this to be a really good way to just sense check your progress on a regular basis, just so that you don't end up internalizing stuff too much or losing a bit of perspective while you're at home. Okay, and one of the great things about being at home all the time, right, is that you have all of this extra time. Well, you might be tempted to like work through lunch or eat at your desk a lot, maybe to like make up for some of that productivity you think is waning. But I think it's super important to try and take proper lunch breaks when you can. And even if you even if you can set up regular in-person lunch dates with your friends if they live close by, this is great. So I recommend doing that maybe like once a week, and it'll give you a little nudge that you need to get out of the house. And if your friends aren't close by, virtual lunch dates are also a really good tip, so long as you're not swamped with calls for the rest of the day. And you can join an initiative at work. So for everyone at my company, before we all started working from home, our social scene was such a big part of our office culture. And it took us a minute to figure out how to maintain this remotely. But setting up a small initiative like this ended up working out quite well. So you could try this too, where you team up with your colleagues, maybe with a goal of just organizing fun social stuff to do remotely. This could be anything from virtual art classes to online games that you play together. And I find usually the sillier, the better in my experience. And lastly, there are lots of digital tools available to help you work with your colleagues remotely, and some of them are genuinely really good. If you're a developer like me, for instance, you might really miss doing some pair programming a lot. And VS Code, for instance, has a great live share feature that lets you and your remote colleagues code in the same project in real time, just like Google Docs. And if you miss workshopping in real life with sticky notes all over the walls, you can do it online as well with tools like Miro, which work really, really well for collaboration, I think. So all of these are just tools and processes that I've personally found most effective for keeping isolation at bay. And I highly recommend trying them out, even if I kind of want to say, especially if it feels a little outside of your comfort zone. And I only say this because I know from experience that they really do work. So, just to kind of recap over all the things that we've covered, we've outlined three core frameworks that you can use to escape isolation while working from home. And the steps are one, to recognize when working from home just isn't cutting it for you. Two, to refine your habits and behaviors and help lift yourself up out of that funk. And three, to retain the good flow with tools and processes that'll just help you keep your head above water a bit. So, hopefully, all of this was practical and helpful. And if you struggle with isolation while working from home, I can personally attest to all of these practices. I mean, I'm not saying that it's like super easy or anything, but I can say that they really make a difference and definitely help get you back to feeling good at work, at home, slash at home at work. And you can find me on Twitter here, where I'll be sharing some links to resources later on. And if you have any of your own practices or tips for working at home, please do feel free to reach out and let me know, because I'm always up for chats and learning new things. So I guess that kind of wraps it up, and nothing left to say, but thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much to You Got This for having me today.